Now, like we've done in past shows with Phil, we're about to start a masterclass. So, Phil, get us started on the U.S. office market as it is current and what it will look like in the coming year.
All right. Well, sure, Dan. I mean, I'll tell you where we've been, and we don't make predictions, but we do make forecasts. So you can debate the distinction between those if you'd like. If you want to go to the next slide, I want to show you what the beginning of a recovery looks like, because I think that's where we are in the office sector of commercial real estate. So some orientation to this slide. What you're looking at on the axis is millions of square feet. So the blue bars represent what we saw on average in a typical quarter in the years 2015 to through the first quarter of 2020. So before any impact of the pandemic had hit the market. And so what we saw nationally is in a typical quarter during that time frame, 15 million square feet of additional occupancy. We call it net absorption. So move-ins minus move-outs. So there were more move-ins than there were move-outs by 15 million square feet in a typical quarter on average in that 5-year period. And then if you move over to the next set of bars, that blue segment shows that there were about 10 or 11 million square feet of positive absorption in buildings that exclude medical office and owner occupancy. So in other words, you can think of those as kind of your traditional speculative multi-tenanted office buildings. So most of that 15 million, 2/3 or so of it, was in these for lease speculative buildings. You move over again, you can see that a big portion of that was what we call 3- and 4-star buildings. So you can think of that as class A below the trophy level, and then sort of down through your class B minus. I would call these investment grade buildings below the trophy level, and we use a star rating system instead of a class A, B, C as a sort of a default measure of quality. But think of these as the biggest chunk of inventory. This is probably 70% or so, and even more than that, of investable real estate. So these buildings, I'll call them commodity investment grade buildings, which is maybe a little unfair, but you got a picture in your mind. So they were seeing positive absorption, occupancy gains through this period. Move to the next set of bars. So buildings that were at least 10 years old. So that's a little bit of an arbitrary cutoff point, but the idea here is we want to look at buildings once they get through their first generation of leases. So are they able to maintain or even grow their occupancy after that 10-year period? You can see 2015 through early 2020, mostly yes, they were losing a little bit of occupancy. And then finally on the right, if you look at just downtown CBD buildings, they were seeing a little bit of positive absorption, but far less, even proportionately, than their fair share of inventory compared to all buildings. So already there was a movement away from CBDs and into more sort of micro-urbanized areas and suburban areas. So that's the blue bars. The red bars show the bloodbath that we've seen in the 5 years since. With all of these groups of buildings losing occupancy, and especially that 10-year-old plus, right? So these buildings were not able to maintain occupancy once the impacts of the post-pandemic workplace hit. And so they were losing tenancy, not able to backfill the space until we got to the third quarter of this year. And that's where you see the yellow bars. So the yellow bars are Q3 of this year. That looks a lot more like what we saw in 2015 through early 2020, where demand for office space turned net positive again. And even those buildings that were 10 years old and older, and this is the key, that I guess second from the right group of bars, that's the one that I'm paying probably the most attention to. What that tells us, when that goes above the axis, when absorption goes positive for these 10-year-old and older buildings, it means space that was once vacated has now started to backfill. And I think that's a key inflection point. So that's where we are. And if you want to go to the next slide, Dan, I'm going to start giving a little bit of caution to the optimism. So I do think that we've hit the inflection point. I'll talk about our forecast a little later, but I will also point to some things that are different than what we typically see in recoveries. So one is this wild variation across geographies. So the first 5 bars here are the 5 largest by square footage office markets in the country. You can see that through Q3 of this year and going back for a year. So Q4 of last year all the way through Q3 of this year. New York has 7 million square feet of positive absorption. It is far and away the national leader in the office sector's recovery. You can see a little further over to the right, Dallas, also seeing pretty strong demand growth. But then you've got DC, Chicago, LA in the middle, still losing occupancy over the last year. Interestingly, I have not called it out on this chart, but San Francisco is now turning slightly positive. So that market is beginning to recover. But it's actually, by square footage, a pretty small market, about the size of Minneapolis, believe it or not one of the 5 largest. The 2 bars furthest to the right show sort of the aggregation of the remaining top 48 markets. That's a cutoff point I use because the top 48 markets in the country all have at least 50 billion in office asset value. And so that's kind of a nice break point. And on average and in aggregate, those markets are still losing occupancy, although there's a lot of variation within them. So like, Nashville and Tampa and Charlotte, positive, San Francisco, positive, but some others like Atlanta, not quite so positive. San Diego, not quite so positive. And then on the far right, you've got all the others. So really your more tertiary kind of markets, sort of trucking along with positive demand. So the point here is that this recovery is quite geographically uneven. I think local economic factors are the big reason for that. New York does definitely also have the strongest return to office figures in the country if you look at a data source like Placer.ai, for example. So I think it's got that going for it. New York and Dallas both have financial services growth happening, which has been one of the few knowledge sectors to continue hiring over the past few months, and we'll come on to that a little more in a minute. But this geographically uneven recovery is quite unusual. Usually we see large markets flocking together a lot more than this. So if you'll move forward, again, Dan, I'll show you something else that's pretty unusual. And that's just, you've heard that the supply pipeline is diminishing, and it is quite fast. So there's 2 squiggly lines on this chart. The blue line goes with the left axis, and that shows as a percent of inventory, how much office space is getting started every quarter. And you can see that it's low. So it's 0.5% and 5 basis points of inventory is how much is getting started every quarter. In square footage terms, the last year and a half, it's been something like 4.5 million square feet every quarter. I mean, that was a good couple of weeks back in 2017, right? So this is a historically low level of new construction that we are in right now, and have been for several quarters, for more than a year, almost 2 years now. And so the red line, which goes with the right axis, is pretty easy to forecast how much new space is going to be on the market in the next 3 or 4 years. And it's going below 1% of inventory. So these are buildings that are 0 to 3 years old. This is, again, a little bit of an arbitrary cut point, but the idea here is buildings that are in a stabilization period, right? They've just been delivered, and they're in the next 3 years or so, we would expect they're gonna get as roughly stable as we might expect them to be. So new buildings tend to fill up, and they pull demand from older buildings. And in a healthy market, older buildings backfill that space, right? In this market, until the 3rd quarter, they had not been backfilling that space. But what's going to happen going forward is, well, there's not going to be any more new buildings to move into. So going to have some implications, both for owners of buildings and certainly for occupiers as well. Especially when you consider what's going on the next slide. So another complicated 2-axis slide, but I'll walk you through it. So the blue line once again goes with the left axis, and this is the share of all buildings that are what we call high vacancy buildings. Now, we define a high vacancy building as 25% vacant or higher. Why do we choose 25%? Well, once again, somewhat arbitrary, but the idea is that if you're 25% vacant and you're an investable asset, at that point, you could start to have trouble doing any more than just covering your expenses, especially if you have a loan on the building and debt service is part of your monthly commitment to cover. Doesn't mean that all buildings at 25% vacant are going to be in trouble, but it's just kind of a good, useful heuristic, I think. So back in 2015 and up through 2020 or so, what we saw was somewhere around 1 in 6, 1 in 7 buildings was a high vacancy building. You get to now, and it's more like 20%. So 1 out of 5 now. So there are more high vacancy buildings now than there were, certainly 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. The red line goes with the right axis, and that shows, okay, in these high vacancy buildings, how much of all total vacant space in the market is concentrated within them. So if you go back 10 years, about 2/3, 65% of all vacant space was concentrated in this 14-15% of high vacancy buildings. Now what we've got is over 3/4, so 78% or so of all vacant space is in the 21% of buildings that are high vacancy. So 2 things going on at once. There are more high vacancy buildings, and those high vacancy buildings are actually increasingly vacant. So tenants are sorting themselves into desirable buildings, and I think more importantly for the market, they are sorting themselves out of undesirable buildings, however they choose to define that. So the last thing that I'll depict here, and then we can have some discussion about the implications. So this is one reason that I think the sector, and not just office, but especially office, is facing some headwinds going forward. And it is just simply the question of, well, where do the bodies come from to fill up the office buildings that have, in many cases, lost a lot of tenancy over the past few years. So the blue line here, which is, it's kind of in the background in a few places, but the blue line here is the year-over-year change in total employment as measured by the BLS. Now, we get a BLS report as we're recording this tomorrow. As you're watching this, it might have been yesterday. It's on December the 16th. That will give us data from November and from October, which we don't have as of the time of this recording. However, I don't expect much to change in terms of the trends. You can see if you go back 10 years, then job growth overall was trucking along at around 2%, 1.5% year over year. I've shaded the time of the sort of pandemic disruption in, massive layoffs and then massive rebound, maybe some overhiring that happened. And then for the last few years, we've seen the blue line come steadily down, normalizing to where it's been around 1.5% to 1%. You can see the forecast suggesting it's going to trend down below 1%. So more on that in a second. That's the blue line. The red line is the same metric, but instead of entire job growth, this is job growth in the traditional knowledge industries, which are professional services, financial activities, and information. So you net all those up together, it's about a fifth, 22 or 3% of total employment. You will often hear these described as office using sectors, so office using job growth. And you can see on the left side of the screen here that before the pandemic, these jobs were growing more than overall job growth. So we were adding more knowledge jobs than we were jobs overall, including hospitality and industrial and transportation, warehousing, and even something like healthcare. Since 2023, and really late 2022, I think is when the inflection point was, you can see that knowledge work job growth actually turned negative, and then over the last year it's been essentially stagnant. So finance has been slightly positive, as I mentioned, but the tech companies have net cut jobs already over the last couple or 3 years. There've been some more headlines recently about layoffs there, and professional services hasn't moved around much. It's been positive, negative, but essentially flat for the last couple of years. So that's the red line. So job growth in the knowledge sector is actually growing or shrinking, but growing less fast than overall job growth. And then there's the yellow line. So you'll see a couple of kinks in this that I think you can sort of disregard. So the yellow line is my sort of personal estimate of, okay, well, let's look, regardless of industry, at what jobs do we expect to be done in an office environment, at least traditionally. There's a very qualitative, it's me going through a list of 900 or something occupations. I'm constantly refining this. So those kinks that you see in like 2020 and then again in the early part of this year, that's me just sort of trying to normalize it to the jobs report series from the establishment survey. But I think the trend makes sense to me, right? So before the pandemic, if you look at office using occupations, they were growing at about the same rate as overall job growth. And that makes sense because, as the economy grows, the type of jobs that get done in offices, you would expect to grow at about the same rate. Well, then, since the pandemic, job growth in these occupations has actually remained maybe a little ahead of overall job growth, but is kind of reverting to that longer term trend, right? And it has remained above, I think this is the key, it has remained above the growth rate for these knowledge sector jobs. Now, why is that important? Well, I think it's important if you think back to what we saw in secondary and tertiary office markets, where they've seen positive absorption, whereas some of the bigger markets haven't. I think that, if you think about a place like Frisco, Texas, or Nashville, Tennessee, or Birmingham, Alabama, or Raleigh, right? These are relatively high growth, smaller metro areas. And when you have a high growth, smaller metro area, what you have is a lot of just organic economic activity that happens. You have construction companies and financial advisors and doctors and lawyers and administrators of all sorts of local businesses. And there's a portion of all of those economic entities whose work is done in an office. And so what you have less of is the sort of inorganic, Amazon comes in and brings an HQ 3.5, right, to your market and creates jobs, right? So organic piece of office using occupation growth has been faster than the sort of knowledge sector, more traditional, what we think of when we think of big office using occupiers. It's been faster than that. Going forward, past that forecast line, you see that all of these are projected, and this is according to Oxford Economics, they are projected to essentially settle at about the population job growth rate, which is what you would expect long term. So I think there's a couple ways to look at this. And number one, the optimistic take would be that yellow line projects to remain, at least in the near term, above the red line. So even if there are, stalls in hiring or layoffs among some of these big ticket household name office using occupiers, that there will be enough in this more organically growing section of office using occupations to provide some boost to demand. So that would be the optimistic take. I think the pessimistic take is Well, yeah, that may be true, but all of these are as high now as they project to be for the next several years and even beyond. There might be a little bit of a temporary bump in some of the traditional knowledge sectors when we finally get through the tariff uncertainty, when we get through to the impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and the fiscal stimulus there. But even so, we're looking at longer term job growth, regardless of how you slice it, with these three lines here at something around 0.5%, which is at best a third of what we saw before the pandemic. Now, not all of this is office related. Like I said, this is kind of demographic related as much as anything else, but I do think it's a headwind for the sector.